If your cucumber plants were covered with fruit just a few weeks ago and now suddenly seem tired and almost empty, then there's a good chance you're making the same mistake that I made for years.
Most people think the season is simply ending when cucumber production slows down. They look at a plant that was producing basket after basket of cucumbers and assume it has done its job. So they stop paying close attention. Some stop watering properly. Some stop harvesting as often. Some even start planning to pull the plants out and make room for something else. The problem is that this simple mistake can cost you an entire second harvest that was still waiting to happen. I learned this the hard way after watching healthy cucumber vines go from loaded with fruit to almost nothing in what felt like a week. At first, I blamed the weather. Then, I blamed the seeds. Then, I blamed the soil. But the real reason was much simpler, and once I understood it, everything changed. The truth is that cucumber plants often do not stop producing because they are old. They stop producing because they receive signals that tell them their work is finished. And, without realizing it, many gardeners send those signals themselves. What makes this even more frustrating is that the plants often look healthy when it happens. The leaves are still green. The vines are still growing. Yet the harvest slows down more and more each week until you are left wondering where all those cucumbers went. If you have ever walked into your garden expecting to pick a bucket of cucumbers and came back with only one or two, then you know exactly what I am talking about. The good news is that in many cases the plant is not finished at all. It is simply waiting for a few small changes before it starts producing again. In fact, one old gardener showed me a method many years ago that helped me get a second wave of cucumbers long after my neighbors thought their season was over. It costs almost nothing. It takes very little work, and when you see the first new flowers appear, you realize just how much production was still hiding inside those vines. But before I show you that method, there is something important happening inside the plant that almost nobody talks about, and understanding it is the key to everything that comes next.
The reason this happens is surprisingly simple, and once you see it, you will never look at a cucumber plant the same way again.
Most gardeners focus on what they can see above the ground. They look at the leaves. They count the cucumbers. They watch for pests. But meanwhile, the plant is constantly making decisions about where to send its energy. And this is where most people accidentally work against themselves. Let me give you a real example. Years ago, I had a row of cucumber plants that started the season beautifully. Every morning, I walked out with a basket and filled it. Then, little by little, production slowed down. I thought the plants were getting old. But one afternoon I noticed several large yellow cucumbers hiding under the leaves. Some were oversized. Some were already starting to turn orange. I had missed them during harvesting. An older gardener who lived down the road saw them and smiled. He told me something I never forgot. He said, once a cucumber plant thinks it has produced mature fruit, its priority changes. Instead of making new cucumbers, it starts putting energy into finishing the seeds inside the fruit that already exists. In other words, the plant believes its job is nearly done. Most people never realize this is happening. They leave a few large cucumbers on the vine because they think bigger is better. Meanwhile, the plant receives a completely different message. It starts slowing flower production. Fewer flowers means fewer future cucumbers. Then, people blame the weather or the variety when the real problem is hanging right in front of them. Another mistake happens when harvesting becomes less frequent. Early in the season, gardeners check their plants every day because they are excited. Later, they get busy. 2 or 3 days turn into a week. During that time, cucumbers can become much larger than you expect. A fruit that looked perfect on Monday can be oversized by Friday. The plant notices that immediately. This is why some gardens seem productive for months, while others slow down halfway through summer. The difference is often not fertilizer or expensive products. It is simply understanding the signals the plant follows. The good news is that if your cucumber plants have slowed down, there is still a very good chance you can change those signals. In many cases, the vines are stronger than they appear. They just need a reason to start producing again. And the first step is so simple that many people overlook it completely, even though it can wake up a tired cucumber plant faster than almost anything else I know. That simple step is exactly where we are going next.
The first thing I do when cucumber production starts slowing down is something that sounds almost too simple to matter.
I walk the entire row and remove every oversized cucumber I can find. Not tomorrow, not next weekend, right away. I look under leaves. I lift vines carefully. I check places where fruit likes to hide. Almost every time I find at least a few that should have been picked days earlier. Many gardeners are surprised by what happens after this. Within a week or two, new flowers often begin appearing again. The plant suddenly has a reason to keep growing because those mature fruits are no longer pulling all the energy away from new production. But there is another step that many people miss, and this one was shown to me many years ago by a man who seemed to harvest cucumbers long after everyone else's plants had slowed down. He told me that once the first heavy harvest is finished, most cucumber vines become crowded with old leaves. These leaves are not always dead, but they are no longer helping very much. They block sunlight, they reduce airflow, they create shade around developing flowers. So what he did was remove some of the oldest lower leaves. Not all of them, just a few at a time. At first, I thought he was making a mistake. The plants looked thinner afterward. But about 10 days later, I noticed something interesting. New growth appeared near the tips of the vines. Fresh flowers started opening. Small cucumbers began forming where there had been very little activity before. Since then, I have used the same approach every season. I never strip a plant bare because that creates stress. Instead, I remove yellowing leaves and some of the oldest leaves near the base. This allows more light to reach the younger growth that still wants to produce. It also helps air move through the plant, which becomes very important during warm weather. Most gardeners focus only on feeding the plant. Few people think about helping the plant use the energy it already has. Yet this simple cleanup often creates results that surprise people. Another thing I noticed over the years is that many cucumber vines still have plenty of life left in them when production slows. They simply become crowded and tired. A little attention can make them act like younger plants again. And once you have removed the oversized fruit and opened up the vines a bit, there is one more forgotten step that can make an even bigger difference. It costs almost nothing. Most people already have what they need at home. And when I started using it regularly, I began seeing something every gardener loves to see after a slow period: a completely new flush of flowers.
Now we get to the step that many gardeners overlook because it feels too ordinary to make a real difference.
After the first big harvest, your cucumber plants have already spent a tremendous amount of energy producing fruit. Even if the soil was rich in the beginning, the plant has been drawing nutrients out of it every single day. This is why I never expect a cucumber vine to keep producing heavily without a little help. But the help I use is not expensive and it is not complicated. Many years ago, an older gardener showed me a simple feeding method that he called a midseason boost. He would wait until production started slowing down and then give the plants a gentle feeding rather than a heavy one. Most people make the mistake here of dumping a lot of fertilizer around the plants hoping for fast results. Sometimes that creates lots of new leaves, but very few cucumbers. What the plant really needs is steady support rather than a shock treatment. My favorite method is simple compost tea. If I have compost available, I place a shovel full in a bucket of water and let it sit for a day or two. Then I dilute it and water around the roots. It costs almost nothing, and the plants respond surprisingly well. If compost tea is not available, a balanced organic fertilizer works too. The important thing is not the product. The important thing is the timing. When the plant starts slowing down, that is when it needs encouragement. I also pay close attention to watering at this stage. Here is something many people do without realizing it. Early in the season, they water regularly because they are excited about the crop. Later in the summer, they become less consistent. A few dry days followed by a heavy soaking can stress cucumber plants more than people think. The vines may survive, but flower production often drops. I have found that steady moisture makes a huge difference when trying to trigger a second wave of harvests. The soil should stay evenly moist without becoming soggy. This simple habit alone has rescued many struggling cucumber plants in my garden. Then something interesting starts happening. New growth appears near the ends of the vines. Fresh flowers begin opening. Bees start visiting again. It does not happen overnight, but you can feel the plant waking up. Most gardeners stop paying attention when production falls. I do the opposite. That is when I become more attentive because I know another harvest may be waiting. And there is one particular mistake that can ruin all of this progress even after the plant starts producing new flowers again. Unfortunately, it is a mistake that most gardeners make without even noticing it.
The mistake I am talking about is one that feels completely natural.
In fact, most gardeners think they are helping their cucumber plants when they do it. The moment new flowers appear after a slow period, people relax. They assume the problem is solved. Then they go right back to the habits that caused production to slow down in the first place. I learned this lesson after losing more than one potential second harvest. The vines would recover. New flowers would open. Tiny cucumbers would begin forming. Everything looked promising. Then, 2 weeks later, production would slow again. It took me a while to understand why. The answer was simple. I stopped harvesting often enough. Cucumbers grow much faster than many people realize. During warm weather, a small cucumber can become oversized before you know it. When that happens repeatedly, the plant starts receiving the same signal all over again. It believes it has completed its job and begins shifting energy away from new production. That is why when I am trying to encourage a second wave of harvests, I make it a habit to check my plants almost every day. I do not always pick something, but I always look. A cucumber picked slightly early is usually far better than one left too long. The flavor is often better, the texture is better, and the plant stays focused on producing more. There is another little secret that helped me more than I expected. Whenever I see damaged leaves or small diseased sections of vine, I remove them promptly. Not because I want perfect-looking plants, but because I want the healthy parts of the vine using as much energy as possible. An old gardener once told me that every struggling leaf is asking the plant for resources while giving very little back. Over the years, I found there was truth in that. A quick cleanup often helps the entire plant stay productive longer. Another mistake happens when people stop watching for pollinators. New flowers are exciting, but flowers alone do not create cucumbers. If bees are scarce, I sometimes notice many flowers opening but very little fruit forming afterward. Paying attention to this can explain a lot of disappointment in the garden. Sometimes the vines are healthy and growing well, but pollination simply is not happening efficiently. The encouraging news is that once you avoid these common mistakes, the second harvest often becomes surprisingly reliable. The vines begin looking stronger. New cucumbers appear where you thought production was finished. And this is usually the moment when gardeners realize their season is far from over. In fact, the most rewarding part is still ahead because there is a stage where the garden suddenly feels productive again, and you start harvesting far more than you expected just a few weeks earlier.
This is usually the point in the season when people start smiling again because they realize the cucumber plants they were ready to give up on still have plenty left to offer.
I have seen it happen many times. A gardener thinks the season is winding down. The harvest basket stays half empty for a while. Then, after making a few simple changes, the vines begin waking up again. New flowers appear almost every morning. Tiny cucumbers start hanging beneath the blossoms. A week later, there are enough for a salad. Another week later, there are enough to share with neighbors. That second wave rarely arrives all at once. It builds gradually. That is why many people miss it. They expect an immediate explosion of production, and when it does not happen, they assume nothing is changing. But cucumber plants often reward patience. I remember one season when I was convinced my vines were finished. The plants looked tired and production had almost stopped. Instead of pulling them out, I followed the same steps I've been talking about. I removed oversized fruit. I cleaned up old leaves. I gave the roots a gentle feeding. I stayed consistent with watering and harvesting. For nearly 2 weeks, it looked like nothing was happening. Then, one morning, I noticed fresh yellow flowers all over the newest growth. Not just a few, dozens. By the end of that month, I harvested more cucumbers than I had during the previous 3 weeks combined. That experience taught me something important. Many gardeners quit too early. The plants are often capable of much more than they appear. Another benefit of encouraging a second harvest is the money it saves. Instead of buying more cucumbers at the store, you continue picking them from plants that are already established. There is no need for expensive products or complicated systems. Most of what creates success comes from paying attention and responding at the right time. That is one reason I like these older gardening methods so much. They rely more on observation than spending money. They work with the plant rather than forcing it, and the results can be surprisingly good. Some years, my second harvest has lasted several weeks longer than expected. By that point, neighbors are often asking how I am still picking cucumbers while their vines seem finished. The answer is never a secret product. It is usually a handful of small actions done consistently. But there is one final lesson that ties all of this together. It may be the most important thing I have learned from growing cucumbers over the years, because it changes the way you look at the entire season and helps you get the most from every plant you grow.
When I look back at all the years I have spent growing cucumbers, there is one lesson that stands above everything else.
Most cucumber plants do not stop producing because they are finished. They stop producing because the gardener accidentally tells them to stop. Once I understood that simple idea, my harvests became more predictable and far more rewarding. Instead of pulling out vines the moment production slowed down, I learned to look more carefully. I learned to ask what the plant was trying to tell me. Was there oversized fruit hiding under the leaves? Were old leaves blocking sunlight? Had the soil become tired after weeks of heavy production? Was watering becoming inconsistent? Usually the answer was hiding somewhere in those simple questions. The beautiful thing is that none of the solutions require special skills. They do not require expensive equipment. They do not require perfect weather. Most of them take only a few minutes. Yet together they can completely change the second half of your cucumber season. That is why I still use these same methods today. They have worked for me year after year, and they continue to prove that simple gardening habits often outperform complicated solutions. There is also something satisfying about watching a plant recover. A vine that seemed finished suddenly starts producing new flowers. Tiny cucumbers appear where there was nothing before. The garden feels alive again, and every harvest basket reminds you that patience was worth it. For people who enjoy growing their own food, there is another reward as well. A longer harvest means more fresh vegetables from the same space, more meals from the garden, more value from every seed and every hour spent caring for the plants. That is especially important these days when many people are looking for simple ways to save money and become a little more self-sufficient. So before you give up on a cucumber plant that appears to be slowing down, remember this: there may still be another harvest waiting. Sometimes all it takes is removing a few oversized fruits. Sometimes it is a little cleanup. Sometimes it is steady watering and a small feeding. Small actions often create surprisingly large results. And every season reminds me of something an old gardener told me many years ago. He said, "The best gardeners are not the ones who work the hardest. They are the ones who notice things before everyone else does." That advice has stayed with me ever since. And if you try these simple steps this season, I think you may discover something that many gardeners never see. Just how much harvest a cucumber plant can still give long after most people think the season is over.